Hello, my name is Mark Sianghio, and I'm a PhD student in religious ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And in a former life, I was a professor of political science and also social scientist and analyst for the Department of Defense. So for me, both religion and science have been very important, very prominent aspects of both my professional life and in the way that I just generally view the world. So it was rather disturbing to me when a few months ago, my 12-year-old brother, who I have because of the miracles of modern science, came to me and said that in his Sunday school class he was doing a presentation about atheism and the monotheistic religions. When I asked him what he meant by the relationship between these two things, he proceeded to define atheism as those who believe in the Big Bang and in evolution. Now, we grew up with the same parents, we grew up in the same household, we grew up in slightly different churches, but I went to when I was growing up, an even more conservative church than he does now. And yet, when I was 12 years old, I was not defining atheism as the Big Bang and evolution. In fact, I told my Sunday school teacher and my youth pastor when I was in seventh grade that I believed in both evolution and in the Big Bang. So I wondered, having very similar upbringings, why my brother was defining atheism and pointing out the antagonism between religion and science at this very early age, where I at 12 did not have that same sense of antagonism between these two things. And to be fair, I grew up in a place where creation happened in 6 days, where God created every species from his own hand. There was no evolution. It wasn't really talked about in my household. But what I think is very interesting, and I think what made the difference, is that I was very open to science and really passionate about science and empiricism and looking at the world through investigation because of the other thing that we did religiously in my household, which was watch Star Trek. And watching Star Trek with my dad, who started life out as a chemical engineer and then went into business, so a scientist himself, who, even though he might have believed in evolution and in 6 days of creation and the universe coming into being that way, still had this love of engineering, of Star Trek's way of solving problems through the scientific method, and not only technical problems, but also investigating human communities and investigating human emotions, looking at Commander Data, who is an android, and really wants to process and understand what it is to be human. Looking at all of those things, there never seemed to be an antagonistic relationship between religion and science, between culture and science. There was always a very, very deep respect. And while science was prominent, it was a way to get at human questions, just like religion does. And growing up with that sort of environment, growing up with that very, very prominent emphasis on watching Star Trek with my dad, something that I did as a kid, it, I think, made me very open to exploration and understanding religion and science to be intrinsically interconnected. Now, I think I can't really think as much of a parallel from the religious side of it, but I think as close as I can get is something that has been very influential in my life as well, which is the Star Wars films. I'm a big nerd, as you can probably tell. But, you have a conflict in the Empire between those who believe in the technical terror of the Death Star and those who really believe in the old ways and the power of the Force, like Darth Vader. And in Luke Skywalker, you have the perfect, I think, blend of both the technological aspect and technological emphasis that we see in a space opera like Flash Gordon or in Star Trek, with this very, very prominent feature of a religious worldview, a worldview that is really centered in and around the Force. And while Star Trek is a way of getting at human questions through science, there is an approach to science and technology in Star Wars that really has its lens, its focusing lens as the Force. You get in the newest Star Wars movie, Han Solo, talking about the fact that, in the first movie he was saying that there's no mystical energy field, none of that stuff controls my destiny, it's all a bunch of mumbo jumbo. And in this new film, he says, it's true, all of it. The dark side, the Jedi, it's all true, and there's a real understanding of how these two things can be in synergy. And so I just think it's interesting that, the dialogue between religion and science, for me, the differences that I see between my worldview and my 12-year-old brother's worldviews, the things that shaped it, I think, are not, talking to scientists or reading academic journals or the, academic investigation of religion, but rather these really fun moments with my father, doing things that, as a young child, really engaged the mind from an entertainment perspective. And so I think that, with the conversation between religion and science, not only do we have to understand and be very careful about the content, but also the presentation of how we approach this conversation and dialogue between religion and science. Thanks for listening.